Great, great. Thank you so much, Patricia, and thank you all for joining me on this Friday afternoon for many of us before a holiday weekend. Definitely appreciate you taking the time to get in some stalking training before your break. So thanks so much for joining me. My name is Dana Flightman. I'm from the Stalking Prevention, Awareness, and Resource Center, which is a project of Equitas. And today we'll be talking about the basics of stalking, understanding the contextual nature of stalking. So SPARC is funded by the Office of Violence Against Women. We are the National Technical Assistance Provider on stalking. So certainly I hope this is the first time, if I'm new to you, if we haven't spoken before, it's the first time we're speaking and not the last. Definitely available for continuing consultation. If you're working on a stalking case and have questions, if you want further training, etc., we're available for all OVW grantees and potential grantees, which covers most domestic violence organizations, universities, and police departments. Before we get into the content today, I'm curious if you could just let me know who is able to join. So Patricia, if you could pull up that poll, folks, let me know what discipline you most closely identify with. Of course, we know that it takes a multidisciplinary response to adequately respond to stalking, help victims be safe, and hold offenders accountable. So I really appreciate all of you taking the time to join the call. Okay, I'll give you just a couple more seconds. And if it looks like we have some victim advocates, DV and SA program staff, prosecutor, and some folks in that other category. If you're in that other category, if you wouldn't mind just typing in the chat box just so I can get a better sense of who's able to join today. I'm also curious, who here has had the opportunity to attend a training on the topic of stalking before? So specifically on the topic of stalking, have you been able to attend a training on this? Either this is your first one, maybe once, or, oh man, I could teach this. I don't even know why I'm listening to this webinar. Victim attorney, great, thank you. Okay, great, it's family law attorneys, Title IX, great. All right, thanks so much for sharing that. So it looks like we have one seasoned person who's listened to a lot of stalking training. Of course, this will be the best one yet, but feel free to, everyone feel free to chime in anytime. It looks like for about half the folks, this is about, you know, the first time that you've been able to attend a training on the topic of stalking. We can close this poll right now, actually. I'm going to pull this up later. Thanks. And, you know, that's not surprising because typically, you know, in our field, the Violence Against Women Act covers 4 major crimes. It's domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. It's always that and stalking. And, you know, we almost called our website andstalking.org because it's something that we just see all the time kind of as almost an afterthought in our field. A lot of times folks don't have as many opportunities to attend training on this topic. And I think you'll see by the end of today's webinar that stalking is a prevalent crime. It's one that you're certainly working on already in your important work that you're doing with victims of interpersonal violence, but we don't always have that lens on, and we're not always identifying stalking in that way. So I hope by the end of this webinar you might be moving that and stalking to the beginning of the sentence and really considering stalking in the work that you're doing. For me, this poll is still up. I just want to make sure that other folks can see. Patricia, are you able to get rid of this here, Patricia? Let me move on. No. Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. So our website, stalkingawareness.org, we did not call it andstalking.org. It's stalkingawareness.org. It has training modules, so it has recorded webinars like this one, as well as if you'd like to lead a training in your own community, we have some scripted programs for that, both for professionals and for public awareness. Resources for victims, like am I understanding stalking, am I experiencing stalking, safety planning resources. We have practitioner guides, and those are broken out by discipline. So we have guidance specifically for prosecutors, for law enforcement, for victim advocates, for awareness educators, for corrections, and of course webinars like this one. We are also on social media. Our handle on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook is at Follow Us Legally. If you get our sick sense of humor at SPARC, and if not, it'll be a long hour for you. So really, your call. Either way, I'm going to keep on talking. So why talk about stalking? So stalking, not only is it one of the 4 crimes under VAWA that many of us in our funding are required to respond to in some way, but we also want to respond to it to better serve victims because stalking is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. So stalking is criminal. It is a crime at the federal level in all 50 states, including the District of Columbia, as well as U.S. territories. It is a crime on tribal lands and in the military justice system. Across the board, it is a crime. It's a misdemeanor or a felony, depending on the jurisdiction and the situation. A lot of folks don't realize that stalking is actually a crime. This is victims as well as responders, and so they look at stalking behaviors and say, well, you know, what am I supposed to do? Call the police because some guy rang my doorbell? And sometimes we have advocates in law enforcement saying, oh, we can't do anything because you haven't been physically harmed yet, right? And the reality is that we can do something a lot of the times because stalking encompasses a wide variety of behaviors, and it is a crime. It is a criminal action on its own across the board, across the United States. And stalking is traumatic. So a lot of times when we talk about why it's so important to understand stalking, folks go right to the co-occurrence of physical violence and lethality. And it is quite important. I'll get to it in just a couple of slides. Absolutely. But I want to pause here and also point out that stalking is a crime not just because it intersects with other kinds of violence, but even if stalking is the only thing happening to a victim, it is a traumatic and terrible crime in its own right. So many stalking victims experience significant mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, insomnia, social dysfunction, and those can be lifelong. Quite a few lose time from work. So 1 in 8 lose time from work. More than half of those lose 5 days or more. And in most states, domestic violence victims are not a protected class of workers, and in very, very few, if any, states are stalking victims protected. So if a victim needs to take time off to deal with the stalking situation, or if they request some kind of accommodation, for example, I want to switch shifts so that I'm not working when my stalker is off, or I don't want to answer the phones anymore, or something like that, the employer typically has the right to fire that employee and say, I'm sorry, that's inconvenient or a risk to the organization or company. And that happens quite frequently to stalking victims where they lose certainly income as well as possibly their source of employment altogether, their job altogether. And quite a few relocate. 1 in 7 stalking victims move. And I think that's really shocking because think about how annoying it is to move when you want to move, right? You've chosen to pack up your things and pack up your family and pay the movers and get everything, and you've chosen to move, and how stressful and expensive and upsetting that can be. We have 1 in 7 stalking victims choosing to relocate, to move as a result of their victimization. So I think that just goes to show how traumatic and consuming the stalking can really be. It's always important to hear from survivors in their own words. This is a quote from a stalking survivor. It said, "It's not easy to describe the fear you have when you see the stalker or signs of the stalker everywhere you go. I have given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I will be looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there." I think this quote's powerful. It's also very typical of stalking victims. Many say, you know, I knew that he'd call me the day I got out of jail, the day that he got out of jail, and he did. That, you know, every year on my birthday, I get that card for him. It can be that very pervasive and persistent stalking that many victims experience. And stalking is dangerous. It often co-occurs with physical assault and sexual violence, including rape. About 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or to actually harm their victims. And 76% of intimate partner femicides, so that's murder of a female partner by a male partner, 76% of completed, and actually 85% of those attempted homicides included stalking in the year prior. There was stalking prior to that homicide or attempted homicide. In fact, this wonderful researcher we work with went so far as to say that stalking is homicide in slow motion. Those early signs that too often get missed or dismissed, or that folks say, well, no one's been hurt yet, or is that really a threat, that add up and escalate over time and can lead to a homicide. Stalking is one of the few crimes where early intervention can prevent violence and even death. When we see those signs, when we call it stalking, we identify it that way, we take the proper safety planning precautions, and we connect victims to the appropriate services, and we hold offenders accountable. Not only can it stop the stalking, which again on its own is a really traumatic crime, but it can prevent further violence and even death. And yet it's very, very underreported. Less than 40% of stalking victims report to law enforcement, similar to sexual violence or domestic violence, right? It's very underreported. And the reasons you can imagine are quite similar. Embarrassment, shame. With stalking especially, they may not be aware that a crime has occurred. So they may not realize there even is a criminal option or that law enforcement would do anything. Or they might distrust law enforcement and say, you know, I don't think that they'll take this seriously, feel it's personal or lack evidence. So for all those and more reasons, most stalking victims choose not to report. In this study, this is about stalking victims who did report. So we have, these are domestic violence involved cases as well. So here we have over almost 2,000 cases of domestic violence. Almost 300 involve stalking. That's about 1 in 6 domestic violence cases that there's clear evidence of stalking. So let me ask you, how of these in this small study, how many cases do you think were charged as stalking? I'll take a look in the chat box here. How many would you guess were charged as stalking? No one's typing yet, but I'm very stubborn, so I'll wait for you. Okay, Kimberly says 0. Becky says 3. Lauren says 75. Okay, so we have all over the map. The answer is 1. So the 0 folks, you were even more pessimistic than the reality, but I can understand why. You were the closest, though. Only 1 of these cases was actually charged as stalking. So stalking is very, very undercharged. And these crimes can be challenging to charge. It's about multiple incidents. It requires more work from law enforcement and keeping up with that course of conduct, more so than responding to a single isolated incident. But even so, it's severely underreported and then severely undercharged. So today we're going to talk about understanding stalking so that we can understand those behaviors when we see them, as well as the intersection with domestic and sexual violence, talk a little bit about safety planning, and leave you with some resources, and that'll be the rest of our time together. So understanding stalking. So I keep saying it's so bad, it's criminal, it's traumatic, it's dangerous. What exactly is it? So there's the behavioral definition and, the legal definition. Legally, there's a different statute, of course, in every state. It'd be too easy if we all have the same one, right? So every state has a slightly different statute. I'm happy to discuss your state statute with you. And while I'm not a lawyer, I'm based in Equitas, which I'm surrounded by lawyers. So they are even more happy to go deep in depth on your stalking statute and how the behavioral definition applies. Because you're coming from all over the country today, we're going to focus on the behavioral definition. But I think that regardless of your statute, understanding that behavioral definition is really, really important, because based on your statute, maybe you can charge stalking in a certain situation, maybe you can't, but you still want to be able to identify that behavior as stalking when you see it behaviorally, because it's its own risk factor. It requires its own response. And we want to be able to name that for victims and connect them to the right resources. So I have 3 scenarios that I've set up these polls, actually, yesterday I set up these polls for you all. And all 3 of these behaviors are bad, but I'm asking you, it could be one of these is stalking, none of these are stalking, all of them are stalking. Is this stalking behaviorally? So if you could pull that back up, Patricia. So a student hides a camera in the women's locker room and watches the women who are in there undress. It goes undiscovered for months. Is this stalking? Yes, no. I'm making you choose. I'm not giving you an unsure. Okay, so I'm giving you a few more seconds. Okay, so most folks are saying no. Okay, but we're a little bit split. Okay, thanks. Okay, let's see, the next one. An ex-partner repeatedly spreads vicious rumors about their former partner on social media. Does that sound like stalking? Yes, no. Okay, like most folks Oh, we're 50-50 split there, and now more folks are saying no. Okay. And the last one, a supervisor, and this one's a little bit long, a supervisor regularly asks their employee personal questions, mocks him in meetings, sends emails at odd hours, is verbally abusive when he doesn't respond right away. So really bad supervisor. Does this sound like stalking, yes or no? I'll give you a few seconds to fill that one out. Okay, looks like we're pretty split there. Yeah, 50-50. Okay, so thanks so much for doing that. So when you were answering these, you might have been like, well, I don't like any of these behaviors, but are they stalking? And it might have come up for you, what exactly is stalking? You know, does it have to be more than one? Is it targeted at one person? So luckily for you, I'm just about to go through that behavioral definition right now and answer some of those questions, and I'll reference these scenarios in there. So behaviorally, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific individual that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So to break that down a little bit, it is a pattern of behavior similar to domestic violence. It's not a single incident or a one-off event. And that's called a course of conduct in most stalking statutes. So you might hear me say pattern of behavior and course of conduct and use them kind of interchangeably. I'm really talking about the same thing here, that more than one behavior in just about every statute, that's 2 or more incidents. And those behaviors can be quite varied. So let's say I'm stalking Patricia because I'm the worst presenter ever. So maybe Monday, I text her all day. Tuesday, I get angry she didn't respond. I smash her windows. And Wednesday, I feel bad. I send her flowers. All of those are stalking behaviors that can be criminal, even though sending gifts or texting someone may be legal outside the context of a stalking case. Those behaviors can become criminalized in the context of a stalking course of conduct. So a lot of stalkers combine behaviors that are criminal on their own, like vandalism, right? Patricia could call the police and say, Dana smashed my windows, and they could respond to that incident. But what I'll encourage you to do is think broader, what else is going on here? Because a lot of times this is quite confusing to victims as well as responders, where they say, well, it's not illegal to send a gift or get a text message, but again, it can become criminal in the context of a stalking crime, along with those other behaviors that sometimes are individually criminal as well. And stalking is directed at a specific person. So if you think about the scenarios that you all voted on in those polls, that first scenario was about a student placing a camera in the women's locker room and filming whoever came by. So that may still be criminal, but it's not really stalking because it's not directed at a specific person. It was for whoever happened to be in front of that camera. Also, that's only one incident. So often the word stalking is misused, and people talk about stalking when they're really talking about a single peeping Tom incident or some kind of voyeurism, which again may still be criminal, but isn't really stalking because stalking is directed at a specific person. Now, if that same student had followed a woman into the locker room and then placed the camera to catch that specific woman undressing and or identified women from that video and contacted them after and said, oh, do X, Y, Z, or I'll release this footage, okay, then we could be looking at a stalking and possibly an extortion case. So certainly that could be part of a stalking course of conduct, but if it's for whoever, not directed at a specific person and it's only one incident, that's not really stalking. With that specific person, though, we do often see what we call target dispersion, which is perhaps a partner stalking their ex-partner. That partner starts dating someone new. Okay, so now the stalker is targeting their ex as the victim as well as the victim's new partner. So there could be multiple victims depending on how you charge that case or what have you. And a stalker may reach out to a victim's friends, family, colleagues. That's very common. So certainly a lot of folks can get involved in that stalking case, but it's still in the context and purpose of reaching that one individual. It's directed at that specific person. And it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So fear is really essential to the definition of stalking, and it's actually what separates stalking from a crime that is often confused with, which is harassment. So harassment is typically repeated behavior that would make someone feel very angry, annoyed, disrespected. And harassment can be quite serious, so I'm not trying to diminish that in any way. But if you think about that third poll you voted on with a supervisor who was texting at odd hours and really disrespectful to her employee, that employee might feel angry, definitely should go to HR, all of that. But that employee is not necessarily afraid of the supervisor. But then let's say the supervisor starts texting her employee pictures of himself walking his dog and saying, why are you doing that instead of working? And he starts texting, the employer starts texting the employee's partner. Okay, now that's scary, right? It's, wow, what is this person going to do? I'm being monitored. They've way crossed the line. So harassment can become part of a stalking course of conduct, but on its own, it's not the same because that fear element is really important to stalking. And I see this misused all the time. You know, I'll read an article that says, you know, she received 50 death threats. It was extreme harassment. Well, I don't know about you, but when I get my death threats, I'm not just annoyed, I'm scared, right? So if there's that fear component, that's really what differentiates harassment from stalking and says this is stalking. But fear is challenging to measure because fear is quite contextual. What's scary to me may not be scary to you, and vice versa. So we're going to watch just a quick, this is a 5-second video, and I want you to think about which of these two folks you identify with more. So Patricia, if you could pull that up. Okay, so that's it. Raise your hand. I know you have that hand raising at the top. If you identify more with the woman in this video, you're like, oh, I don't do spiders. That's not me. Okay, I see a couple people being honest. Yeah. Is anyone like, we're burning the house down, we're out? Okay. 2 people. Yeah. Who here can kind of relate a little more to the man in this video who's looking at her like, what is wrong with you, right? It's just this little spider. Can you please calm down? Okay, I'm seeing a few more hands go up for that one. Does anyone identify with the spider? No, just kidding. Okay, so we're a little bit split there, which is fine, but most of us, even if we really hate spiders and can understand where the woman's coming from, we can understand where this man's coming from, right? It's this tiny thing. This woman is absolutely panicked. It seems like an overreaction. But what if I told you this woman had been bitten by a spider the year before that looked just like that? She had a terrible allergic reaction, went to the hospital, and almost died. Hopefully we wouldn't still be making that face at her that's saying, what is wrong with you? Because what did I give you there? I gave you context, right? Information. And context is critical in stalking cases. It's really everything, because a lot of times what's scary to the victim may not seem scary at all to us as outsiders. So for example, this was a case in which this woman called the police, absolutely hysterical. All she would say was, there's a cup of coffee in my car. So understandably, the police are not sending out the SWAT team on this one, right? They're kind of like, you prefer tea? Like, what is your problem, you know? And eventually, she calmed down enough and said, he's here. So it turned out this was a stalking victim, had been stalked by her abusive ex-boyfriend. She had relocated, address confidentiality, the whole deal, really thought she had covered her tracks. She leaves to go to work that morning. She gets in her car. There's a cup of coffee in her car with his old nickname for her on it. So I can't see or hear you, but typically when I, tell that to folks who I can see and hear, they kind of make a collective ugh sort of noise, or shake their heads or sigh. And what that means is that a reasonable person would feel fear, right? Assuming that you're all reasonable people and you had that reaction, I'm being very generous, right? That a reasonable person would feel fear. But when we don't know the story and we just hear there's coffee in the car, we're like, that sounds great. These smart cars have everything, right? Amazing. It's really up to us to think, could this be fear? Could this be stalking? And what is the context of this? And ask those right questions. So something may be frightening to the victim, but not to you as the responder. So we need to ask, what message did that send to you? Why was that scary to you? Tell me more about that. Because typically if victims are afraid, there's a reason, but it may not make sense. In fact, the behaviors might seem benign or even nice to an outsider, like receiving, the classic example is, a victim receiving roses at work, and the abuser had previously told her, I'll send you roses the day I kill you. So the victim's terrified, and the coworkers are saying, oh, how sweet, you got flowers, right? So that outside perspective is not always helpful in assessing what's actually scary. And stalking behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between that victim and that offender. And so there's no way for us to know why it's scary unless we ask. And like I said earlier, it criminalizes otherwise non-criminal behaviors, which can be quite confusing for victims as well as responders. One good way to assess fear is to ask victims what they've changed as a result of the stalking behavior. Because we don't always like to admit when we're afraid, right? And I'm sure you've all worked with victims who are angry, who might just seem really frustrated and angry. They might have no affect at all, or they're very likely to minimize the situation. And of course, this happens with domestic and sexual violence as well, and it certainly happens with stalking. So for example, our director, Jen Landheis, was a victim advocate for years who worked out of a law enforcement office, and she always recalls this case in which a victim came into the police department and said, you know, my stalker found me, he held a gun to my head. Oh, I ruined the story there. He threatened to kill me. All she said was, you know, he cut my landline, he threatened to kill me. I came to the police department. And so the responding officers went out to respond, and the victim just casually said, oh, do you think he'll take his gun away? And so the victim advocate made sure that, you know, the responding officers knew there was a gun involved. And then asked the victim, you know, I'm curious why you didn't mention that there was a gun. And the victim said, oh, well, he holds a gun to my head and threatens to kill me all the time. He never actually hurt me, right? And so this victim, I'm not saying she's unreasonable. She's just responding to the repeated trauma that she's experienced, right? But because of that, she may not be articulating fear in the way that we would expect, right, or that we would if someone held a gun to our head and said they'd kill us. Most of us, I think, would be afraid. And that's where that reasonable person standard is actually quite helpful, because even if the victim's saying, oh, I wasn't scared, because that happens all the time, we can use that standard and think about, well, if this happened to me, would I be scared? Or the reasonable person standard is typically, if this happened to someone else in the same situation, and would they be afraid? So, and so victims might, you know, present a variety of ways. It's also worth asking them, have they changed their routes? So I talked to a victim who said, I'm not afraid, but, you know, I left his picture with the security guard just in case, and I changed my routes to and from school, and I installed a security camera. Because that's not something you do when you're just kind of annoyed with someone. That's really representative of some kind of fear. And the reason that's important is to differentiate stalking from other crimes like harassment, and also because in many statutes there is actually a fear requirement where we need to show fear specifically. So it's important to be thinking about that depending on your statute when you're working with victims. And the truth is, when victims are afraid, there's usually a reason. So we're going to go ahead and watch the rest of this video and see why this victim was so afraid. All right, so in this one, the victim had very good reason to be scared, right? So who's looking cynically now? It's probably the victim here, or the woman in this video. And so there's multiple studies that show that when that victim fear is an excellent predictor of victim danger. So if they're afraid, there's probably a reason, and it's up to us to be figuring out what that reason is and what's really going on. The thing with stalking, though, is I actually hear the word stalking all the time. It's just misused quite often. So raise your hand if you've heard something like this. You know, I was Facebook stalking you, and I saw you went to Mexico. It looked awesome. Yeah, so I'm seeing hands go up. Almost everyone, right, has heard this kind of thing. Does this sound like actual stalking to you? Type me in the chat box and let me know. Does that sound, assuming these people know each other and are friends, right, and share these things consensually? No, why not? Why isn't that stalking? Because there's no fear, right? There's no fear here. It's not scary when you post pictures on social media for your friends to see, and then your friends see them. Like, I have a pug. I can only go like 20 minutes without mentioning him, so I'm like at my limit right now. And of course, he is on Instagram. If someone's like, I saw your pug on Instagram, I'm not like, wow, back off, that's so scary. I'm like, thank you for looking, right? Because I posted it there. I put that out there. It's not scary. And in this case, it's not scary. The thing is, we hear stalking all the time in this context, though. Like a friend the other day told me, I was stalking your pictures. And I was like, you can't stalk my pictures because they cannot feel fear because I'm popular and have many friends. But this casual usage of stalking, while it doesn't cause stalking, of course, it does kind of create an environment in which stalkers get away with it and can kind of sort of dilute the seriousness of that crime. And it's a bit unique to the crime of stalking. Like, nobody says, oh man, that party was so lit, it's arson, right? That's not a thing people say. If someone says, I think I experienced arson, we're like, wow, you should call the police. Like, that's really serious. So the problem is, well, again, this doesn't cause stalking. It does create an environment where people are not calling things stalking when it actually is stalking because, again, it's extremely underreported and often misidentified. But then we are calling it stalking when it's not. It can kind of lessen the severity of it where we have people wondering, well, is this really stalking or is it just, stalking? So I encourage you to think about your use of that language as well as just how that can impact both the victim's desire and ability to recognize what's going on as serious as report it, as well as for us as responders, how do we respond? How seriously do we take stalking? And has that changed based on the way that we hear it used in our language? Before I move on, any questions on the behavioral definition of stalking? I'll give you just a few seconds to type in there. And of course, you can continue to type your questions and I'll try to have some time at the end. Okay. I don't see any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. So I'll explain what stalking is, how prevalent is it, what's going on here. Well, stalking is extremely prevalent. Over the course of a lifetime, about 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men will experience stalking. And this is using actually a very conservative definition of stalking. In this study, they asked people to identify if they felt very afraid that they or someone close to them would be physically harmed. So you can imagine respondents saying, well, I felt afraid, but was I very afraid? Even with that, we're still seeing 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men saying, yes, I've experienced that. When they've taken out this very, which they've piloted, we're seeing rates more like 1 in 4 women. So I believe they're doing that the next time they do the survey, so I wouldn't be surprised if the stalking rates increase, not necessarily because there's more stalking, but because more of it's being captured by the research. But even if we use this really conservative definition of stalking, we're still seeing about 1 in 6 women experiencing that in the United States. So if you think about sexual assault, that's about 1 in 5 women just on campus. Domestic violence is 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 women, depending on which study you read. So with stalking, 1 in 6 women is right up there, and yet for about half the group, this is the first time we've had the chance to attend a training just on stalking, right? It's definitely something that you're dealing with, but it's not something that we talk about quite as much. I also want to point out that I'm talking about women and men in this very binary way because that's the best available research and how it differentiates. People of all gender identities experience stalking, absolutely. So women report experiencing stalking at much higher rates than men do, and the vast majority of stalking victims report that the offender is male. That's true for about half of, well, that's true for overwhelmingly for female victims. Over 80% say the offender's male, and about half the time male victims are saying that the offender is male. So outside of an LGBT context, why might that be happening? And the reason that often, not always, but often happens is it's an ex-partner stalking their ex's new partner. So, a male ex-girlfriend starts seeing someone new. Now that ex-boyfriend is stalking the ex-girlfriend as well as her new boyfriend. So that's not always what's happening, but that is quite a bit of that men stalking other men. And we know that stalking happens in an LGBT context as well. Unfortunately, we just don't have a great national study on it. There's one recent campus-wide study that showed that LGBT students experience slightly higher rates than non-LGBT students on stalking, and anecdotally talking to victim advocates, it seems the rates might be a little bit higher in the LGBT community, similar to dating violence and sexual violence, but we just don't have good national data on that yet. So when I Google stalking, like I do because I'm fun, these are the kind of pictures I get. So as you can see, there's some binoculars, there's a lot of kind of shadowy, lurking people in the background, a lot of hoodies. My favorite is this second from the left in the middle here where this guy's wearing a hood and a mask and behind a computer, but did not cover their webcam. So you get these kind of shadowy, lurking stranger kind of ideas, and I'm sure it won't surprise you all to know, since you're all in this field, the vast majority of the time, the victim knows the perpetrator, right? Overwhelmingly, the victim knows the offender. So again, I don't expect that to surprise you all with the work that you do, but when I'm talking about stalking to folks outside the field, I'm fun at parties and stuff, people are shocked by this. They really are, because when most folks think about stalking, they're thinking about celebrity stalking. They're thinking the Kardashians, they're thinking Taylor Swift, and indeed our stalking laws do actually come from a celebrity stalking case. It was Rebecca Schaeffer's murder in the 90s in California that led California to enact the first stalking law. So while celebrity stalking does happen, that's not what the majority of it is. Those certainly aren't the cases that you're all working with in your work. But similar to domestic, or not domestic, but rather sexual violence, where people will say, oh, it wasn't rape because I know that person. People as if with stalking as well. Oh, it wasn't stalking because I know that person. When in fact, that it's most likely to be an offender that you know as the victim. About half the time overall, the offender is a current or former intimate partner. That's true about 60% of the time for female victims and 40% of the time for male victims. But I want to make the point really strongly that if about half the time the offender is a current or former intimate partner, that also means about half the time the offender is not a current or former intimate partner, right? They're an acquaintance, a family member, a person of authority like a boss or a professor, or sometimes even a stranger. And so I encourage you to think about, in your response to stalking, no matter where you're situated, typically our response to stalking is housed under the domestic violence response. And that's not wrong, but it is a bit incomplete, because if I'm experiencing stalking by, say, a neighbor, would I think to reach out to some place called the Family Violence Center? That's really unlikely. And to the folks answering the phone there, know how to direct that call and get them to the right place. So I encourage you to think about, are you serving all victims of stalking? If you're not, do you know where to refer them? If you are, that's awesome. Would they know how to find you? And we actually have a checklist on our website for domestic violence and sexual assault service providers to help think through some of those issues. Is the word stalking on your website? Do you share those stories? Do you use that language? That kind of thing. So definitely check that out as well, and think about, are we reaching all of these victims? Oh, and here's the checklist that I just mentioned. So definitely a good one to check out to think through your response. So stalking behaviors, like I said earlier, can be quite varied, and I don't mean this as a compliment to stalkers, but stalkers tend to be very creative criminals. I often hear that the most disturbing, bizarre cases were stalking cases. So like say, if a victim comes to you and says, I know it sounds crazy, but that might be a stalking case, because usually victims and offenders know each other. A lot of times as an intimate partner, the offenders are going way out of their way to do something creepy and specific and bizarre just to get to that victim. And they count on it sounding crazy to limit the victim's ability to access services and be believed and get a response. So there's a lot of different stalking behaviors. We'd be here all day if we wanted to think through all of them. And this is a helpful framework from this wonderful researcher, T.K. Logan, called SLY, just to help think through what some of the behaviors might be. So I'm going to ask you to share some examples in the chat box in a second. So surveillance would be, how is the stalker watching, monitoring, tracking, gathering information about that victim? So in the chat box, go ahead and let me know what are some ways that a stalker might do that. If you can be creepy and get in the mind of a stalker just briefly, and then for this exercise, and then of course come back out. But what are some examples of surveillance? Here, I see a few folks typing, so I'll give you a second. GPS device, yeah, absolutely. Stalking through the use of technology. So it could be a surveillance camera. It could be some kind of hacking into the phone and watching where the person goes. Cell phone apps, certainly spyware, so definitely that technology piece. But also, I'm so glad some of you are mentioning that, just physically following somebody, or binoculars. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of stalkers are using both technology and in-person methods. So sometimes we think right to that technology, you know, watching what they post on social media, did they RSVP to this or that event, spyware, etc. But plenty of stalkers are still following someone in the car, waiting outside their office or apartment, you know, just physically showing up and following them, reading their mail, going through their trash. That those kinds of surveillance strategies are still what a lot of stalkers are using. Absolutely, yeah. The second category is life invasion. So how is the stalker showing up in the victim's day where the victim does not want that stalker to be there? But there's just the stalker or signs of the stalker. No matter what they do, is they're trying to get through their normal day. So what are some examples of what that might look like? I'll give you a second to type some of those. So how is the stalker showing up in the victim's day? All right, I see multiple attendees are typing, so I'm just giving you a second for that to come through. Excessive calling, turning up at work, yeah, absolutely. Going by their place of employment. So they're just there. They're trying to get to work, and the stalker's sitting outside their office. They're trying to get through their normal day, but they're receiving constant calls or texts or emails, constant reminders that the stalker is trying to get in touch with them. They might be there physically. They might be messaging them or emailing them all the time. But yeah, absolutely, this kind of invasive tactic. It could also be actually entering their home. So it's really common for stalkers to break into a victim's home or vehicle and not take anything, but leave some sign that they were there. So, you know, if they always drink a certain kind of soda, they might leave a can of that soda, or they leave the TV on a channel that they and the victim used to watch together, or they just move a lamp, right? And so when the victim gets home, they know that offender has been there, but unless they had some kind of recording or security system, they can't prove it because all that's there is that soda can, right? And nothing was taken, nothing was stolen or damaged. And so, again, that I know it sounds crazy, but I just know that that person was here. That kind of life invasion is really common in stalking cases. Someone else said connecting with the victim's friends, family, or support system. Absolutely. So we often see that. We call that sometimes proxy stalking, stalking through someone else. So if they're shared custody, they might ask, you know, oh, is dad seeing anyone new? Is mommy taking you on vacation? That kind of thing. Even just think about a victim going, you know, through their day and a friend saying, oh, guess who I ran into? You know, it was the stalker, and they asked this about you, or they asked that about you, if the friend doesn't know that person. So it's that, and also just joining their events, you know, those shared social networks. So suddenly the stalker is showing up at all these different clubs and groups that they were never in before. So yeah, absolutely all really good examples of life invasion. Interference, so same, if you could help me think of some examples. So it's similar to life invasion, but what is the stalker actually taking away from the victim? What is the victim losing or afraid of losing as a result of the stalker's behavior? What are they actually losing here? Someone talked about the job earlier, so absolutely, like I mentioned before, a lot of stalking victims do lose their jobs or at least time from work because they're being interfered with. It could be that the stalker leaves bad reviews or complaints about the employee. It could be that they are constantly contacting the employee and so they can't focus on their job safely. It could be a variety of ways that they interfere with that person's ability to do their job, or even if it's outside the context of work, whatever it is they might be trying to do. Let's see. It says multiple attendees are typing, so I'll give you a second to type in a few more examples of interference. I read a stalking case in which the offender stole the victim's car and then sold it. So think about interference. Absolutely, just physically interfering with that victim's ability to get just about anywhere in that community, get to work, etc. So really actually taking things, property damage. Some said making a flat tire so they can't get to work. Yeah, absolutely. So just interfering with their property. Spreading false rumors. Yeah, and someone said something similar, trying to discredit the victim with providers, especially mental health providers. That's a really, really great point. I'm so glad you raised that. So way back when I started talking, you did those polls. One of them the question was, is it stalking for someone to repeatedly spread rumors about their partner through social media? And you may be thinking, well, how could that be a crime? Like, people gossip, people talk, people have rumors. You know, how can we criminalize that necessarily? But it depends what kind of rumor and if it would be repeated, targeted, and likely to cause fear. So, for example, there's many stalking cases that include the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, which more commonly called revenge porn, mostly because non-consensual distribution of intimate images is kind of wordy to say. We don't like to call it that because it's not necessarily about revenge, and it's not really porn or wasn't intended to be porn. But regardless, you know, so we've seen an offender either taking or even photoshopping false nude images of a victim, making a flyer, giving that to everyone in the victim's workplace or apartment building, and saying, you know, here's what with rumors about, here's what I'm into sexually, and also including their address information and where to find them. So as you can see, that could place someone in real physical harm, as well as being really interfering with their ability to be safe in their community, to get another job. It could ruin reputation, all of that. So that kind of spreading rumors, whether it's to that level or not, can actually be stalking, absolutely. So ruining their credit. Yeah, financial abuse is really common in stalking cases. If you just think about all the different accounts that we have online, from banking to academic programs to, you know, anything like that, often offenders get into those accounts and then they can ruin someone's credit, order things, sign them up for things, drop them from things. Which someone else said, sending vendors to their house. Yes, I read a really, really shocking case in which the offender just kept sending services to the victim's home. So it could be somewhat legitimate services like plumbing, pizza, all of that. And then he started also sending drug dealers and other people doing illegal activities. The victims had to actually put a sign out in front of their home that said, if we called you, it wasn't us, please go away, because throughout their day, they're being interfered with and their life has been invaded, right? Their address is out there, I'll be served, people keep coming. So yeah, I think those are all really great examples of interference. And last but not least, intimidation. Just for time, I'll wrap that one up. So intimidation could be really almost all the things that you all mentioned earlier, because contextually, you know, leaving that can of soda can be quite intimidating, or that coffee cup that we talked about earlier. It could be an explicit threat, like I will hurt you, I will harm you, said in person or through some kind of technology. Or it could be an implicit threat, which a lot of times it is. Some of your statutes require fear, and not only just fear, but fear of bodily harm. And so being able to explain why something was intimidating to a victim can get really important if you're prosecuting this and going through the criminal justice system. So thinking about why was this intimidating and the contextual nature of that is really, really critical. Could also be threats to harm themselves or others, symbolic violence, threatening to harm a pet or actually harming a pet, like that. So I think you all came up with a lot of really, really great examples. I'm just going to see if there's any here that I also meant to highlight. Let's see, yeah, I think. No, I think that we pretty much got them. I would just say also that stalking through other people, that someone else mentioned, that proxy stalking, that's really common. It can happen when the third party, you know, when the friend or mutual acquaintance knows they're helping a stalker, or when they don't. So, for example, there was a stalking case where this detective I work with says, you know, there's an elderly man who lived across the street from the stalking victim, and the stalking victim is being stalked by her ex-boyfriend. The witness, you know, this man did not know they'd broken up, and so one time he called the man, the offender calls the man and says, oh, you know, I can't get a hold of her, and I'm just so worried because it's snowing. Did she get home okay? Can you look and see if her car's in the driveway? So the man looks out and says, oh, yeah, her car's in the driveway. She got home okay. Oh, thank you so much. Right, so he was not trying to help a stalker, but did. And, of course, most people are trying. They think they should get back together with that ex-partner, so they're going to tell them where they are. Also, custody interference. A lot of times when there's joint custody using the children, we've had offenders give children items, gifts that include tracking devices, or simply asking questions about the parent. So All of those and more. And again, stalkers, I don't mean this as a compliment, but very creative, the most bizarre things are often stalking cases. When you're thinking about going through the criminal justice system with this, like I said, depending on your statute and the facts of the case, you may or may not be able to charge stalking. But the truth is, if you have more than one of these other charges, it's worth looking at these and saying, well, let's make sure we charge something, so then down the road when something else happens, now we have those two acts and we might have a stalking course of conduct. So of course it depends on your statute and the situation, but here are just some other things that tend to be part of some behaviors that tend to be part of many stalking cases to consider, so that we're not telling victims, oh, there's no crime here, because often there is something that could be a crime there, even if we can't charge it as stalking yet. So most stalkers are using more than one behavior. The majority have those unwanted calls and messages, spreading rumors, following or spying, and a variety of other things. So most are using more than one means of approach, and again, they're using a combination. They're not just stalking in person or through technology. Many do both. 2/3 of stalkers pursue their victims at least once per week. Many pursue daily, and this really shocks me. The average duration of an intimate partner stalking case, so not the high end, the average, is 2 years. And so stalkers have plenty of time to start with one behavior and then disappear for a while and back off, and now they're back doing something else. So when we think about safety planning, it's not only what we've already seen, and we tend to be quite incident-based, both with law enforcement and sometimes with victim advocates as well. You know, a victim comes in, they're worried about one thing, we safety plan around that behavior. But again, we want to think broadly about what else is going on here, what other behaviors have happened or might be happening, because most stalkers are using multiple behaviors, and their strategies can evolve, or de-evolve rather, as time goes on. So I know I'm a little bit short on time here. This is often my problem. So I'm going to have to kind of speed through these next sections a little bit. And then, of course, next week we're offering a full webinar just on the intersection of stalking and intimate partner violence in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So I'll hope that you'll join me then to learn more about this really important subsection. But I have a poll for you here about how often are you working on domestic violence cases, would you say, in the work that you're doing. So Patricia, if you could pull that up, that'd be great. How often are you working on domestic violence cases? So daily, weekly, monthly, annually, rarely. I know you're in different roles, but if you're an educator, you know, how often are you educating or mentioning domestic violence, that kind of thing. Okay, so most folks are saying daily. We have a few weekly, monthly. Okay. So same question, but how about for stalking? How often are you working on stalking cases? Yeah, we can see here the numbers are shifting, right? We're seeing some folks saying weekly, quite a few saying monthly, which is great, but about half are saying rarely. That's not something that I see very often, whereas before the majority was on daily. The truth is, if you're working on domestic violence cases, you probably are working on stalking cases, because stalking is often part of domestic violence. So a lot of times in our field we hear, you know, oh, he was abusive, and it's usually a she left, and then he began stalking her. And while that can happen, I encourage you to rethink that. If during the relationship he was following her, texting all the time, showing up at her work, finding out where she was, getting information about her from her friends and family, that's domestic violence, it's emotional abuse, and it is stalking, right? It is both. And stalking over half the time is happening during a relationship, when it's also happening after a relationship, right? So it's either during, and after. Over half the time, there's that stalking going on during the relationship. And that's really important to recognize, because it actually has the potential to criminalize what we often call emotional or sometimes technological abuse, right? And it's hard because we can't make it a crime that, well, so far we haven't been able to make it a crime that someone's just really mean to somebody else, that someone's emotionally abusive. But if those emotionally abusive behaviors include tracking, monitoring, following, and all those stalking behaviors, that actually is a crime. It's stalking, and there's something we can do about that. And so I think it's actually a really powerful thing to recognize. We also want to recognize our intimate partner stalkers because while all stalkers can be dangerous, absolutely, on average, intimate partner stalkers tend to pose the greatest risk to their victims, including weapon use, physical violence, and quick escalation, and their recidivism rates are higher. So when you're working on a domestic violence case and there's stalking, that should be a big red flag. Of course, we're taking all of our domestic violence cases seriously, but to realize there's stalking here, this is something I really need to pay attention to. There could be a major risk going on. Stalking co-occurs with a variety of other crimes. I already mentioned vandalism, extortion. Sometimes stalkers are stalking because they're trying to commit a crime and they're gathering information to do so. So they might follow someone around to find out where they live or what their schedule is like so that they can, for example, rob them. Sexual assault can happen at any point in as a stalking course of conduct. In this case, there was actually sexual assault first, and then the offender started contacting the victim to try to convince her that it was not sexual assault. So it was sexual assault that then became a bunch of contact that amounted to a stalking case. If we think about grooming as stalking as well, and unfortunately I don't have time to do a deeper dive on this, but when any crime that involves grooming, so for example this particular type of sexual assault, grooming for child pornography, anything that's repeated contact that's targeting a specific victim and trying to build a sense of rapport or trust with them in order to commit a crime, I encourage you to see that through the lens of stalking. Is it a pattern of behavior? Is it directed at a specific person? Would it cause a reasonable person to feel fear? And there's no stalking statute that says when fear has to attach. So if, for example, in this college sexual assault example, if we have, you know, a freshman woman saying, well, I wasn't scared on day one when this upperclassman approached me, but now when I look back and realize our entire relationship was a setup for them to build a relationship with me, invite me to a party, isolate me, and assault me, that's terrifying. And it all started with that time they waited for me outside of class. That could still be a stalking case. So I encourage you to think about that with the other kinds of crimes that you might be seeing and working on. So I'm sorry, I'm going to have to skip ahead here a little bit. In terms of why name stalking, I think I've already talked about this a little bit. This isn't just a matter of semantics and me saying, oh, it's nice to call things stalking, so do that. It's really about a few things. One of the major ones is charging and prosecution options. Most prosecutors like having a menu of charges to choose from. It's also a great charge for prosecutors because if they're prosecuting a single incident of domestic assault, for example, they can't bring in that time 2 years ago that the offender sent a bunch of threatening text messages or stood outside the window creepily, because they'll say, oh, that's prejudicial. It'll be hard to bring that in. If you're charging stalking, you're charging the entire course of conduct. So you can actually bring all of that in and paint a much fuller picture of what that domestic violence relationship really looked like, because it's all of those incidents. So it can be a really powerful charge in that way. We also want to name stalking for safety planning purposes because it's a unique crime, and it requires its own level of assessment, its own risk assessment, and its own recognition that this could be an increased risk for victims. As well as victim empowerment. It can be quite empowering for victims to be able to actually articulate, I'm experiencing stalking versus, oh, my ex has gotten creepy, right? To be able to use that language, because most victims aren't going to call you and say, I'm experiencing a course of conduct that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear, right? They're going to say, my boss is making things awkward, I'm being harassed, my neighbor's being creepy. And so it's up to us to be thinking, could this be fear, could this be stalking, and to name that so that they know it's a real situation, it's a real crime, and there are resources available. Of course, we need a systemic response to stalking. We need our awareness educators to be educating folks on stalking so they identify it and take it seriously and report it. We need our law enforcement to hear those reports and say, this sounds like stalking, get them to the right place, take those reports, investigate. We need to be communicating across disciplines and jurisdictions. Stalking almost definitionally crosses jurisdictions, and so it's really important to have that coordination across different departments and prosecution. I know that I'm about out of time here, so I'm just going to skip ahead and just do this quick thing on responding to victims. And certainly if folks have to leave, I understand. Feel free to send me an email anytime with questions or to follow up, and I hope you'll join me next week as well. I'm going to just type my email here into the chat box to make sure, because I know that not everyone has time to stick around, so sorry about that. When you're responding to victims, the first thing you want to do is advise disengagement, and that's because stalkers see any contact as a win. So if the stalker calls 100 times and the victim picks up and says, I hate you so much, never call me again, tomorrow the stalker's calling 101 times because they see any contact as a win for them. That being said, disengagement is not always possible, right? So we want to realize that. So sometimes the victim reaches out to the offender because they want to be able to take the temperature of where that person is. So for example, there was a case where it was being prosecuted and it came out that the victim had called the offender at 2 a.m. So of course the defense is saying, well, how afraid could she be? She called him at 2 a.m. and talked for hours. She asked the victim why she called him, and she said, well, yeah, I called because I knew that that's when he gets off work at the bar, and I heard him, drive home, get into bed, and fall asleep, so I knew he wouldn't come over, knock on the door, and wake up my kids again. So that victim wasn't calling because she wasn't afraid. She was calling because she was afraid, right, and wanted to take the temperature, and it's kind of that keep your enemies closer thing. And so what you want to do is advise disengagement and let victims know that may not always be possible. So to keep a dialogue open about that, so it's not a dirty secret they're afraid of telling you, that they're able to talk to you about that safety plan around it, and it's not a secret that comes out later. You can collect evidence based on that. Documentation is really critical, but a lot of times we tell victims document, but we don't really tell them how. And so this is an incident log that's free and available on our website. So it's just the date, time, description, location. Again, stalking often crosses jurisdiction. If there were witnesses, that information, the police, and the officer name and badge number. And that's just because it can be very multiple incidents. We want to make sure that we're showing this pattern of behavior. So we want to keep track of who the victim's reporting to, what jurisdiction it's in, and who it was. There is a risk assessment specifically for the crime of stalking, and you can access this through our website. We're going to do a deeper dive on this in January for Stalking Awareness Month and go through it. So I hope that you'll join us then to do that. It's called SHARP. And so if a victim's experiencing stalking, I highly recommend using this wonderful tool developed by T.K. Logan, the same researcher I mentioned earlier on the slide analysis. And it's a little too long for responding officers, but for victim advocates or investigators, it's great and really helps. It creates a narrative of the stalking situation as well as some safety planning suggestions. And of course that doesn't replace the individualized safety planning with a victim advocate, but it's a really good place to start. With orders of protection, they're only as good as the enforcement. They're great for law enforcement because they criminalize that coming near the victim, but the con is they can escalate the situation, right? And so it's best to ask the victim, how do you think the offender will respond? Some victims will say, oh my goodness, they'll be so embarrassed, they will never do it again. Others will say it'll just make them angry. So you want to talk about that with the victim. And I know it's easier said than done, but that coordination is essential for all the important work that you do, and especially, I'd argue, for stalking, because we really need folks at all levels taking this seriously to keep victims safe and hold offenders accountable. A couple of resources: Equitas for prosecutors, if you're working on prosecuting stalking, free 24/7 technical assistance. More on tech safety through NNEDV, the Safety Net Project's really wonderful for that. Lots of free resources on technology. There's no national stalking hotline. The closest thing we have is Victim Connect, run out of the National Center for Victims of a Crime. They'll refer stalking victims to the appropriate services, often housed under domestic violence services, like I said. January is National Stalking Awareness Month, so if you're doing something for, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which I hope you are, I hope that you're also using our resources and promoting awareness of stalking all year round, but especially in January, and we house those social media materials on our website. of course, everyone's favorite website, stalkingawareness.org. You can sign up we send about a quarterly newsletter. You can sign up through the website as well as follow us on social media. Thanks so much. I'm sorry I ran just a few minutes over. I'll stick around in case you do have any questions because I'm here. And if not, like I said, thank you so much for the work that you do for victims and survivors. It's so important. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to spend a little bit of time with me thinking about stalking. I hope it was helpful and provided you with some information and tools. Please reach out. We're a relatively new project, and we want to be there for you. We want to give you the resources that you need to do your work. So please reach out anytime, and I'm more than happy to talk to you and provide additional training in person or online as well. So again, thanks so much, and I will stick around if there are any questions. And have a wonderful long weekend for those of you who have the federal holiday.